Scusate, signore. Sono di voce le mossole. C'è para, papa. Dacci una
And there's more comedy from Sid Caesar next Wednesday at the slightly later time of 11:45. Hey, you know that, Roseanne?
You guys did it again, huh?
Did what?
You were listening at the door, Dan.
Great.
Well, have you heard she's a,
What?
Oh, you mean she...
Yes, another one at her age.
Well, excuse me for ovulating.
Roseanne is having a new series starting at 10 this Friday.
It just makes me want to sing.
After the break, there's coverage of the Gulf War and world events and Channel 4 News Midnight Special.
My brother and I are identical in every way. Except you can take me anywhere.
How can we be sure this room is at the right temperature? He's happy. If he was cold, his fur would stand up to trap warm air. He'd shiver. He'd hug himself to keep warm. She's not saying much. If her fur is standing up, it's hard to see. She's too young to sweat or shiver. The only way to tell is to touch her. She's fine. Hardly surprising. British Gas central heating is one of the most controllable systems known to man or beast. Gas, the heat of the moment.
Imagine a shampoo, this pure, this gentle, Timotei, with natural herb extracts, rinses clean away. No matter how many times you use it, Timotei, all it leaves is beautiful hair.
When it finds you, a cold makes you suffer day and night. Now, Benylin Day and Night brings 24-hour relief from cold and flu symptoms. 3 tablets for daytime relief from runny nose, headaches, shivering, and 1 for easier breathing, helping you to sleep. Day and night from the makers of Benylin.
They can save us 20%.
To find out if you can save money on your home insurance, call Direct Line.
When I need you, I just close my eyes and I'm with
Sheba. Delicious pieces of meat, chosen and prepared with tender, loving care.
It's only a heartbeat away.
In 5 days, we'll change the way you wash your face forever.
No way, I told them. Nothing gets skin clean like soap and water. But I find soap can be a bit drying. You can't win. Or so I thought.
We asked Rachel to use Ulay's foaming beauty wash instead of soap for 5 days.
After rinsing, my skin felt smoother. Just as clean as with soap, but without the dryness. My skin really surprised me. Much, much softer in just 5 days.
Ulay's foaming beauty wash will change the way you wash your face forever.
I'll never use soap again.
It's a fact that 9 out of 10 people still aren't eating enough fiber. So it's worth knowing that in a single bowl of Kellogg's All-Bran, there's about as much fiber as you'd find in 21 tasty new potatoes. Kellogg's All-Bran, a great fiber provider.
Where should we go on holiday this year?
Kenilworth might be nice.
Short break in Berkshire?
Leeds, perhaps.
Every week, Dalton's Weekly gives you Britain's biggest choice of holidays and short breaks, from self-catering cottages to hotels, villas and flights abroad. More than any other publication.
Right, the Dalmatian coast it is. He can stay next door. With Phoebe.
Oh, Phoebe.
Now Town 4 from the studios of ITN, Channel 4 News Midnight Special, presented by Nicholas Owen.
Hello. At 11 minutes past 12, welcome to tonight's Channel 4 News Midnight Special on the Gulf War, to bring you the latest events, plus comment on and analysis of the implications of them. We can be sure it was a military command and control facility. Those words were used in Washington by Lieutenant General Thomas Kelly a few hours ago, words at the heart of a concerted effort by America to justify the bombing of a bunker which killed many civilians in Baghdad. Just how many died still isn't clear. The Iraqis say 500. Western correspondents who went to the scene saw more than 200 bodies. Allied military and political spokesmen say they regret the deaths, but insist they acted on accurate intelligence when they mounted a precision raid on the place. Much Arab opinion is outraged, and here a group of Labour MPs has tabled a motion condemning the barbaric slaughter of innocent men, women and children. We'll hear in detail the Americans' evidence for their point of view and try to assess both what happened and what the wider impact might be. We'll also look at the other war, the propaganda one, which looms so much larger with the Baghdad incident, and at what's happening at the UN, where the Security Council's now holding its first meeting since the Gulf War began. My guests include, for the military and diplomatic developments, Air Chief Marshal Sir Michael Knight, who was UK representative to NATO from 1986 to 1989, and Dr. Rosemary Hollis from the Royal United Services Institute. We're joined too by Karma Nabulsi, who has been the PLO's deputy representative in London. There'll also be two journalists of decided views about the conflict, Bruce Anderson, ex-Sunday Telegraph, and Martin Jakes, editor, Marxism Today. First, we'll take a look at the headlines from the Gulf. Western reporters in Baghdad say they saw at least 200 dead bodies, including women and children, after 2 Allied missiles struck a bunker in Baghdad. Iraqi officials claim up to 500 civilians were killed. The United States has said it regrets civilian deaths in the bombing of a protected bunker in Baghdad, but claims the shelter had been used by the Iraqi military and that it was a legitimate target. In New York, the United Nations Security Council has met for the first time since the beginning of the war. As we speak, the representatives are discussing whether to meet in closed session, as the United States and Britain want. The White House expresses sadness, the US Defense Secretary his sincere regret at the deaths of Iraqi civilians. Both insist, though, it was a military target. Baghdad calls it a criminal attack on innocents sheltering from the nightly Allied raids. Whatever the truth, Western reporters have seen dozens of charred bodies brought out of the bunker in Baghdad. Iraq says there are hundreds more inside. This report from ITN's Middle East correspondent Brent Sadler in Baghdad is subject to Iraqi censorship. Correspondents in Iraq are restricted to areas approved by the Iraqi authorities. The report contains potentially disturbing pictures of some casualties.
If there was one place of safety to survive the Blitz of Baghdad, it should have been this purpose-built shelter. It was clearly hit twice because the points of bomb entry through thick, reinforced concrete were unmistakable. The explosions at one end of the bunker turned the structure into a giant furnace, incinerating those inside. While Iraqis were grieving over their dead, Washington claimed the shelter was an active command and control bunker, feeding instructions to the Iraqi army. The mayor of Baghdad was among officials here. He said this:
I can't tell you what's my reaction. Nobody can comment on that picture.
The regime is already using these disturbing scenes of trauma to attack the Allied coalition for the ongoing aerial bombardments. At one hospital, staff were trying to arrange the dismembered corpses into something recognizable. Most of these people may never be identified. But could it have been a mistake?
No, it cannot be a mistake because they hit the door first and then they hit the actual shelter second to make sure that nobody goes out alive.
ITN was taken deep inside the shelter to watch emergency teams recovering more bodies. Here I could freely inspect the damage. There was nothing obvious to suggest this building served as an important military center. I only saw blankets and human debris. Estimates of how many people were sheltering and died here vary widely. It was still fiercely hot many hours after the explosions, and plastic gloves melted into the hands of rescuers. The shelter is now being ventilated by huge pumps so we can see in here and breathe. It is boiling hot. There is a raging inferno somewhere back there, and they're saying that there are still many more corpses to pull out of here. No one may ever know just how many Iraqis were sheltering here during the air raid. Another unrecognizable victim was put into a blanket. I think it was the body of a woman, and they hurried outside with the remains. Distraught, hysterical people watched. At Yarmouk Hospital, young and blistered survivors spoke through the doctor of what happened.
He was asleep. Just all of a sudden there was a big blow, and he got up.
And then?
And then felt that the blankets were burning, and the whole place was smoke and fire. We were covered with a blanket, and we were hit by 2 blows. Rockets. And everything was converted into fire. They're all civilians. This shelter was specially made for civilians. And they thought that they would be in safe haven.
People gathered in Amaria for most of the day, mourning. It is impossible to find out exactly who was in the shelter at the time of the bomb blasts. But Washington's final word on this incident is that if it's Iraq's policy to put civilians into military targets, then Saddam Hussein is responsible for their deaths.
Brent Sadler reporting from Baghdad. Just to be clear about this, his report is subject to Iraqi censorship because correspondents there are restricted to areas that the authorities approve. However, the Iraqis didn't actually censor any part of that report itself, but we at ITN did edit out some scenes because we regarded them as too distressing to broadcast. Now, the Pentagon held a press briefing to leave the world's media in no doubt about their version of the circumstances in which the US forces made their attack on the shelter in Baghdad. We're bringing you an extended portion of that briefing in which the Pentagon explained its view of the incident and its belief that the building concern was undoubtedly of a military nature.
Let me give you a close-up now. This is that alternate command and control facility. As you can see, it's kind of bounded by a residential area to the north and south. There's a school that's located very nearby, as well as a civic recreation center, and a mosque that's located about 100 meters away. Because it was located in the middle of a lot of civilian kinds of facilities, we chose 04:30 in the morning local time to strike this target. At that time, 2 bombs, laser-guided, went right down through the center of that facility. It's baffling to me as an American, and it hurts me deeply to see that apparently civilians were placed in this, what is clearly a military facility. Saddam Hussein, who lives in this city, has seen the results of a very strategic and surgical bombing campaign directed against that military infrastructure. He had to know that we knew that this was a military facility. And why he would put innocent civilians in this facility troubles me greatly, and is something that, quite frankly, just mystifies us. Well, why do we know this is a command and control facility? We know a great deal about this facility. For example, we know that in the early 80s, during the Iran-Iraq War, this facility was constructed. But the key point is it was converted to a military command and control facility in the late 1980s. As a part of that conversion, it took over ownership by the military. There was clear and definite association with command and control equipment. That command and control equipment that was there was actually hardened. It was hardened to protect itself against both a normal bombing attack that would take place, plus it was even hardened to the point that that it would withstand a nuclear attack. In other words, it had electromagnetic overpressure EMP protection, electromagnetic pulse protection.
Wouldn't protect it from a nuclear weapon landing on it, but if there was a nuclear weapon in the area, EMP hardening allows you to continue to communicate through that. That's the EMP protection.
It protects the communications equipment.
That's correct. Protects the emissions.
Absolutely. The point being, this is not a shelter in the classic sense of the word. It had a lot of military-associated equipment there. In addition to that, even though the ceiling, or the top floor here, was some over 10 feet thick, they had reinforced that with metal. Big sheets of steel. Now, that's in addition to what you've already seen. The fact that it has a camouflage roof, the fact that it has a security fence around it with barbed wire, and it had clearly some measures that would allow it not for free access. The other last point that I forgot to say is apparently there was no air raid shelter. You would not expect civilians to be fleeing into this facility.
Air raid sirens.
Air raid sirens, I'm sorry.
You have described military construction, military equipment, but what was there that told you it was being put to military use other than the technique of construction?
We are sure that it was a military command and control facility. We are not going to go into sources and methods of how we know that, because that would help the enemy to counter it in some other regime.
Which helping the enemy is silence on
The
that.
briefer in Riyadh today spoke of communications coming from that facility. Were military communications coming from
We
that
specifically do not talk about our ability to intercept Iraqi military communications, because that would then allow them to change the way they're doing it. We wouldn't be intercepting that. And I don't agree with what you said, sir. The silence is helping, and we think we're being very forthcoming with the information. Yes, sir.
Earlier today in the briefing in Riyadh, it was asserted in the 1980s that it functioned as an air raid shelter during the Iran-Iraq War. Somehow you've omitted that fact today. Was it indeed an air raid shelter during the Iran-Iraq War? Two questions. And if it was, given that you all have said that the Iraqis have co-located military stuff in civilian areas in order to protect it from attack, did you take any special precautions to ensure that it wasn't being used again as an air raid shelter, so as to protect their command and control operations? And the second question, which for you, Captain, is if you saw military people coming and going to that facility, as they suggested in the briefing in Riyadh today, please explain to us so we can better understand how it was that you didn't see civilians coming and going to that facility.
Do you want me to take that? There are three questions there. I'll decide to answer them. First, my understanding is it was built originally as an air raid shelter. That's what was said in theater today. That's why we didn't say it again. It was converted to a military facility subsequent to that. We are sure of that. Third, we did see military people going in and out. Why didn't you see civilians going in and out? Maybe they didn't go in and out till after dark last night, and we didn't have a picture of it.
You don't have the capability, your explanation is you don't have the capability to detect the presence of individuals moving in and out after dark?
We can't detect everything. We don't have a 100% capability. Well, let me finish.
Yes, sir.
They could have gone in after dark last night when we weren't up there looking. We had the airplane scheduled to come in to bomb it. But I think the overriding fact is, sir, that it was a military facility, and that's why it was bombed. We are chagrined if people were hurt. The only information we have on people hurt is coming out of a controlled press in Baghdad.
Well, that's the Pentagon's detailed view of what happened. Obviously, there are some things they're not prepared to say. Now then, Sir Michael Knight, what did you make of all of that? Are you persuaded of their explanation?
Yes, I am. I mean, first let me say that I find those pictures as horrifying as anybody else would. War is a pretty horrifying business, isn't it? It's pretty bad. It's bad enough for soldiers. It seems more tragic and worse for innocent civilians. And I guess it does perhaps no good in the present circumstances to suggest that it's equally bad and has been for those in Kuwait. I would merely say that I think on the evidence we have so far, and I would stress that I have no more evidence than you or others have had, I would certainly tend to give great credence to the Pentagon's explanations for this, that they believe they were attacking a genuine military target. I'd find it difficult to imagine an air raid shelter which was protected against nuclear blast, let alone being camouflaged or surrounded by barbed wire. And we have some evidence that these were facts about this particular shelter. There are indications that it has been used up to very recently and probably was still being used up to last night as a command and control centre. There is, you see, no military value whatsoever in attacking civilian targets, none at all. And clearly there's no political value in it. Witness the understandable, adverse political implications that this will have. So, I mean, it was a military target and they went for it and they hit it.
There was reference to those journalists, they're talking about yet another briefing in Riyadh, which we haven't played, but there they talked about the matter of the communications coming from that facility, but the general there and the naval man said they wouldn't go into the sources and methods. What are they talking about? Some sort of communication from there to troops in the field, and that can be detected from satellites or whatever, can it?
Yes, it could, and I presume that is exactly what they're referring to. I have clearly no detailed information about that other than what we're hearing from Riyadh. I think that, well, I go back to what I said earlier, that there was no doubt whatsoever, I am absolutely certain in the minds of the coalition commanders that this was a genuine military facility. Now, if it were being used, as has been suggested, because it was a military facility being used for civilians, there would be various explanations for that, and one would not like to prejudge those at this stage. We do not know enough. But I could just suggest that if Saddam Hussein were looking for propaganda, which clearly he is going to be able to make out of this, and you're going to talk about propaganda later in the program, then he's not been able to get very much of it. In the hundreds of raids that there have been over the past 4 weeks on Baghdad, on Basra, and on other centres of population, by the very precise bombing that has taken place. This target, whatever the target was, and I assume it was a military target, I'm confident in that assumption, was very, very precisely hit.
If it is now realised that civilians are likely, from the American military or Allied military point of view, that civilians are likely to be in installations which also have important military use, do you think it possible that politicians will tell military men, lay off them?
I think it is eminently possible, yes. I mean, that we've heard from the Pentagon that they would not have attacked that target had they known, had they thought that there were any civilians in it. And clearly that must be some yet further constraint on them, because they have, when all is said and done, in the 67,000 sorties, of which at least 40,000, 35, 40 must have been combat sorties, where ordnance was released, they have exercised incredible care and precision. I don't think we should overemphasize that.
Now,
and that's to take nothing from the horror that we have just seen.
Now, Karma Nabulsi, do you think that this was essentially a military target?
No, I don't. I mean, if we can just go back to a few years ago when there was another heavy saturation bombing, which was in Lebanon, and you see the way civilians react to that. They stay clear of military installations. I can't imagine that Iraqi civilians would have been going into that night after night if they knew that it was a military installation, especially after the kind of bombings there's been over the last few weeks on military installations. And I think you know, people aren't that stupid. They know what's going on. They would have heard exactly what kind of things were being bombed. And I think from the reports that we heard during the day from people that had seen it and talked to the people in the neighborhood, that was being used not just last night, but for the last few weeks.
Is it not possible, though, that Saddam Hussein, who's shown himself to be a ruthless man, the record is quite clear about that, I think everyone would agree, is it not beyond the bounds of reason that he would put civilians, make sure civilians were present in that sort of target, to give himself either the propaganda victory or to hope to deter attacks on such installations?
I mean, again, you would then have to have soldiers forcing civilians at gunpoint to go and sleep in military installations. Now, I don't think that would be happening in Baghdad at this time. I really think it's unrealistic.
Isn't it possible the civilians could just not realize what the building was?
Well, if people knew that there was military going in and out. I mean, I think there's a difference in that Baghdad is an armed city. There's a lot of soldiers around. But it's very specific in the laws of war, and I think Sir Michael will agree that, that having military or non-civilian personnel around does not change the status of a civilian neighborhood. And if it's a majority of civilians, or if there's some soldiers coming in and out, that would be very normal for soldiers, as opposed to it being a command center. So I don't think people would expect that soldiers coming in and out of a building makes it a command center. I think there's soldiers all over the place.
We hadn't heard, Karma, you've said something just now which I hadn't heard before quite so explicitly stated, and that was a belief or a statement that this facility had been used for the whole of the last 3 or 4 weeks by civilians. Do we actually have proof of that?
Well, I was listening to a reporter earlier today on the radio, and he said he had talked to people in the neighborhood, and what I could hear from what the people were saying that were being interviewed, they said, we have been coming here every night, or our families have been coming every night and sleeping here. So it seems clear that it wasn't just last night that they came in.
Well, I just want to bring Dr. Hollis in here quickly. A little bit later we can go on to the sort of implications of this and the people who are going to react to it and sort of things that have been said already. But do you have in your own mind some doubt and scepticism about this business, that Saddam Hussein may have not set up this particular incident, but certainly an incident which will serve his purposes extremely well?
I think it's important to emphasize this business of the integration of the civilians with the military targets, to put that together with the fact that the coalition are not aiming for civilian targets. If they were, they'd be going for different targets. They'd be going for clearly suburban neighborhoods and so on. And they, as Sir Michael has said, see no productive purpose in going after civilians. So they were aiming for what they saw as a military target. The way they have been reporting indicates they are appalled at what has happened, and they are inferring, perhaps, that there's more to this than meets the eye, since it has worked out the way it has.
Well, when you say that more than meets the eye, you mean the Iraqis are concealing something about this? Is that what you're saying?
They are suggesting that maybe this is the explanation. Otherwise, how could this have occurred? Because we are very clear in our minds, they're saying, that we were going for a military target. But to come back to the point that with the soldiers all around, and in the nature of the society, and the society is now at war, it is very difficult to weed out what is going to be used for purely civilian purposes from what is going to have some military connection.
Yes, we must take a break. Do join us after it, and we'll come back and continue talking about this and other subjects which have been coming up in the last few hours. Do join us then.
Now you can get thicker, fluffier softness in a handy little box that saves you money. It's easier to carry and less to throw away. It's the new Lenore Refill. It refills any conditioner bottle, so now you get the best softness for less in one little box.
Cats are great. They always want to help. Right now, their help is all I need. Uh-oh, what's Tom getting up to? I know. Given a choice like this,
Whiskers!
most cats would prefer Whiskers.
As you can see, we all rely on Whiskers.
Whiskers, the most preferred cat food.
Oh!
Don't delay. Pick up your new Argos catalogue today.
There you go, Billy, your favourite.
Actually,
and
Mum,
here's your special bowl. Cornflakes. Since when?
Kellogg's Cornflakes. Delicious flakes of corn drenched in ice-cold milk.
why don't we ever get any of...
Kellogg's Cornflakes. Have you forgotten how good they taste?
If you're sat around at home, make new friends on the telephone.
0898 550055. Chat back.
golden wonder pots. Just make sure you take yours with you, eh?
Where should we go on holiday this year?
Kenilworth might be nice.
Short break in Berkshire?
Leeds, perhaps.
Every week, Dalton's Weekly gives you Britain's biggest choice of holidays and short breaks, from self-catering cottages to hotels, villas and flights abroad. More than any other publication.
Right, the Dalmatian coast it is. He can stay next door. With Phoebe.
Phoebe.
Du pain, du vin, du boursin. Do you?
What's this? Fairy Ultra. Non-bio, we can't recommend that.
But it's a technological breakthrough. Leaves other non-bios behind.
Well, leaves them behind, eh?
Yeah.
Look, all I want to know is, will it out-clean the leading non-bio at low temperatures on tough stains like...
tea?
Beetroot.
Beetroot.
Ah! I knew it wouldn't shift the beetroot.
No, this is the Fairy Ultra one.
It did shift it.
New Fairy Ultra. At low temperatures, all it leaves behind is other non-bios.
Welcome back to this Channel 4 News Midnight Special on the Gulf War. The headlines. The United States has said it regrets civilian deaths in the bombing of a protected bunker in Baghdad, but claims the shelter had been used by the Iraqi military and that it was a legitimate target. Iraqi officials claim that up to 500 civilians were killed when the structure was struck by 2 missiles in a residential area of Baghdad.
By the Iraqi government throughout this operation. Within the last 2 weeks, this particular bunker became even more active as a command and control facility.
Well, Iraqi officials claim that up to 500 civilians were killed when the structure was struck by 2 missiles in a residential area of Baghdad. Western correspondents reported seeing more than 200 bodies, including women and children. In New York, the United Nations Security Council has just voted for the first time in 16 years to go into secret session. Some council members have criticized the United States for letting the bombing campaign go too far. And the UN Secretary-General Pérez de Cuellar has expressed profound regret at the magnitude of civilian casualties in the bombing of the Iraqi bunker. And at home, the Chancellor Norman Lamont has cut interest rates by 0.5% to 13.5%. The banks have cut their base lending rates to match. However, Building Society said they wouldn't cut their mortgage rates until there was a further reduction in base rates. Now, I'm joined on the telephone from New York by our reporter Kevin Dunn. Now, he is covering the United Nations. It's essential that we hear from him now. Kevin, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good morning, Nick.
Good morning to you. Now, we know that the United Nations Security Council was due to go into session, but they've been arguing about whether that should be closed or not. What's been the result of those deliberations?
Well, the result of those deliberations, which incidentally lasted 2 hours of open debate, was that by the minimum margin, by 9 votes out of the 15 members of the Security Council, the Security Council has adopted a British proposal, the British proposal to go behind closed doors tomorrow to discuss the Gulf crisis. There were 2 votes against Britain's proposal, predictably from Cuba and Yemen, who have consistently opposed Britain and the United States in the Security Council, and there were 4 abstentions. Those abstentions perhaps affected by the impact of the news of the civilian casualties.
Now, do you think, therefore, that the Baghdad incident is having quite a profound effect on the way the UN now approaches the subject of the Gulf War?
Well, it's certainly disturbed and shocked a lot of delegates here today, and some people are suggesting tonight that the number of abstentions, as I say, 4 out of the 15 members, was higher than expected, precisely because of the shock of the news of the civilian casualties. It also has profoundly disturbed Secretary-General Javier Pérez de Cuellar, who, in frankly what was a swipe at the Americans and the British, said that he was dismayed by the magnitude of the casualties, and that's the strongest language he's used so far about the situation and about the Allied bombing campaign.
Do you get a sense from the British and United States representatives that they are at all nervous that their support in the Security Council, support for the resolutions that have led to the conflict, that support may start now to melt away?
There's little evidence of it actually melting away, because the members of the Security Council who are members of the coalition are all standing very firm. It was quite significant tonight that the Soviet Union remains very much on board, stressing that before there can be any question of a peaceful solution, then Saddam Hussein must get out of Iraq. So the Americans and the British, who are obviously the lead players, I beg your pardon, out of Kuwait. So the Americans and the British, who are the lead players here, at the moment remain very confident that they can hold the coalition together. And of course, were they to need to, although they would prefer not to, they can of course fall back on a veto.
Now, finally, when they actually get round to discussing and debating, I mean, are they actually going to have very much new to say to one another, apart from providing a report on the way that the war is going?
Well, not really, no. This is the irony of this meeting, in that the two countries that actually wanted the meeting and have been calling all along for it, I'm referring to Cuba and Yemen, are now saying that they're effectively going to boycott it. In other words, because it's going to be behind closed doors, they won't address the meeting. And the countries who didn't want the meeting in the first place, Britain and the United States prominent among them, will actually be addressing it in private. So there's a certain irony which can probably only occur at the United Nations about these proceedings, but it's something that really Britain and the United States didn't want to come up in the first place. They believe that what Operation Desert Storm is merely implementing the 12 existing Security Council resolutions, and that until there is full implementation, in other words, Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait, then there is no need for the Security Council to meet.
Kevin Dunn at the United Nations, thank you very much indeed. And we'll be going on to talk about, in more detail, about the United Nations' role and what its likely future course may be a little later in the programme. Now, we've been discussing already and hearing reports from the Pentagon briefing and so on about the bombing of a bunker in Baghdad. The Iraqis say something like 500 have been killed. Western correspondents talk about seeing 200 bodies. The Americans have said that they don't want to hurt civilians and that they regret civilian deaths. But the US Defense Secretary, Mr. Cheney, has insisted the underground bunker in Baghdad was a legitimate target, and he said the bombs hit with great precision. ITN's Washington correspondent Bill Neely sent this report.
The White House was quick to justify the bombing. Civilian deaths were tragic, but the nature of the target was clear.
We will not target civilian facilities. We will continue to hit only military targets. The bunker that was attacked last night was a military target.
The US says it doesn't know why civilians were in the bunker, but accuses Saddam of using them to shield his military.
We urge him once again to save his people and to comply with the UN resolutions.
We want to warn you right now, the pictures you're about to see are indeed graphic, and that everything...
The most graphic war images since Vietnam were broadcast to American homes by all 4 main networks this morning. There is little evidence of any change in the public's view of the war. The scenes have shocked, but they'll not result in what one analyst calls the Vietnam effect.
The American people are not going to turn against this war until American casualties start to mount. We don't much care how many Iraqi casualties there are.
America's business community rallied round the Defense Secretary today. He expressed regret at the deaths, but no regret at the choice of target.
We did, in fact, drop 2 bombs on it. They hit with great precision, and there's no question in my mind or in the mind of our key people that what we hit was a military target.
But he hinted that the focus of the bombing may soon shift from Baghdad.
So we're now, I think, in a situation where we can increasingly shift our attention from those strategic targets inside Iraq and focus increasingly upon the ground forces that he's deployed in southern Iraq and Kuwait.
For Iraqi Americans, these are difficult days. Today, perhaps the worst.
If they will not die of the shortage of the food and the water, I'm sure they will be killed by that bomb.
I don't understand why they bombing my mom's family.
The president refrained from direct comment on the bombing, but the US is well aware of outrage elsewhere. The administration is now trying to limit the political damage of last night's bombing, especially among its Arab allies, arguing that it hasn't exceeded the UN mandate, which allows for the use of force. Just how much force to use over Baghdad, though, will remain a key issue until the ground assault begins.
Bill Neely reporting from Washington. Now, I'm joined from Washington by Marshal Wiley, who was head of the US mission in Iraq between 1975 and 1977. Mr. Wiley, what's your reaction to the destruction of this bunker and the loss, clearly, of a lot of civilian lives?
Well, I don't know what the true facts of the situation are. I'm not sure that any of us do at this point, but the one thing that I am certain of is that Saddam Hussein will use this and has won a tremendous propaganda victory over the United States and over the West. And I think this could be quite disastrous for us in terms of the ultimate political outcome of the present operations in the Gulf.
Do you not accept, though, what the Pentagon and other military men there have been saying, that this was a perfectly legitimate and important military target?
I accept the fact that they thought they were bombing a legitimate military target, but obviously there were a lot of civilian women and children in it. Now, in my experience, you do not have a lot of civilians, particularly women and children, in a command and control center, which are normally highly restricted and highly classified operations. So I can't explain this. The fact that a lot of civilians were killed seems clear. And I also accept the statements of the U.S. government that they at least thought they were bombing a strictly a military target. But whatever the facts are, the fact remains that this has been a tremendous propaganda victory for Saddam Hussein.
Now, you're familiar with the way things used to work, anyway, in Iraq at the time you were there. Is it not beyond the bounds of possibility that Saddam Hussein could ensure that there are plenty of civilians in such a target?
I think this is a possibility, but I think we also should be more careful in our bombing and try to avoid hitting even military targets that are in highly populated areas, because in any bombing attack there's always a certain number of bombs that are going to miss the target. Normally, if you have 80% on target, you think you're doing pretty well, but that leaves 20% that are going to go elsewhere in the area. And for purposes of our own political objectives, it's important that we not appear to the Arab world to be attacking civilian populations in a major Arab country. So my advice to the Pentagon would be to stop bombing targets in Baghdad proper and to limit ourselves to targets that are clearly away from population centers, military targets that are clearly away.
Even if those targets are militarily very important, could play a great role in directing Iraqi troops during the coming ground offensive that's been so talked of?
Well, I think there are other ways that we could cut the channels of communication without risking killing large numbers of Iraqi civilians. Once you get into a war, there's always the emphasis on the quick victory for understandable reasons, but we have to keep this into the proper political context of what our ultimate goals are, what we're trying to achieve by this war. And I think we're in danger of intensifying the military operations to the point where we will ultimately suffer a political defeat.
When you say that, do you mean a possibility that Syria and Egypt could actually leave the Allied coalition, or could be forced by public opinion, such as it is in those countries, to leave the coalition? Is that a danger?
I think that is a danger. There is obviously a rising tide of support for Saddam Hussein in most of the North African Arab countries, and I'm sure Egypt is not immune from this. Now, at what point it would become uncontrollable or so strong that the government would actually change its policies is difficult to predict. But certainly there is an increasing sense of support for Saddam Hussein, which is exactly what he is trying to do. He is trying to pull a political victory out of a military defeat, which he will do if he, one, survives, and two, emerges as the hero of the Arab world who has stood up to the aggressor nations and taken their strongest hit and survived. That's what he's trying to do, and we may well be playing into his hands.
It's not been really clear, Mr. Wiley, from what the President has said and people like Mr. Baker and Mr. Cheney have said, what might actually follow the war. Do you think that America is now in the position where it might be forced to leave troops in the region for a long time afterwards? What's your view of what may come afterwards?
Well, that depends on how the war ends. I would hope that we would not create such an unstable situation in that part of the world that we would be forced to leave troops there, because I think the mere presence of Western forces would, over time, generate additional instability. and probably threaten the regimes who permitted our forces to be stationed there. So I think our objective should be to create stability in the area. And that is where we may come into conflict with our political objectives. If we decide we have to smash the Iraqi regime and the Iraqi military, we could well leave a Lebanon situation in Iraq, which would not be in our interest.
Mr. Wiley, finally, from what you've been saying earlier, would you expect now to see an actual change in emphasis of the tactics of this war?
I don't know. I think statements have already been made by Secretary Cheney that we were now going to concentrate more on bombing the military targets in Kuwait and less on the deep penetration bombing into Iraq proper. I hope that that can be done, because I think in terms of our political objectives, it's very important that we shift away from bombing in heavily populated areas.
Marshal Wiley in Washington, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
Now then, we come back to our guests here in the studio, and I want to go back to Dr. Hollis, Dr. Rosemary Hollis. From what Mr. Wiley was saying, do you agree that there would seem now to be the moment, at least, to change tactics? Might this be a sort of a good time to be doing it anyway in the course of this conflict, do you think?
Well, it may be a watershed that people like Mr. Wiley were waiting for, simply because if you watch the way the war has developed and see that the bombardment of the Iraqi infrastructure, which certainly serves military purposes, also serves civilian and economic purposes. And as those observing have had to watch this gradually dismantled, they begin to wonder what this means for the future of Iraq. And he is saying that if it is the dismantling of Iraq, fine, that serves a military purpose in terms of getting them out of Kuwait. But what does it mean for the stability of the region in the long run? And does it mean that you lose all the political objectives behind your military operations? So I think he's hit on a point which has begun to worry members of the coalition and has already made many Arab observers deeply suspicious of what this is all about.
Now I'm joined by Bruce Anderson, formerly from the Sunday Telegraph. Do you think this should lead to a rethink about the way this war is being fought?
I think it's important to keep a sense of perspective. I don't know how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs we've dropped on Iraq yet. Probably vastly more than was dropped on Germany on the whole of the Second World War. Now, this is the first major killing of civilians. Now, it's a tragedy. The pictures we saw were horrible enough, apart from the ones you didn't broadcast. But something like this was inevitable. Precision bombing is quite a remarkable development of modern technology. I'm sure the Air Chief Marshal would agree. The ability of the American forces to land their bombs on target is quite outstanding. But it was almost inevitable that sooner or later civilians would be caught up in this. And anyone who didn't think that that would happen and hadn't, as it were, mentally braced themselves, I think was being unrealistic about the nature of this war. As to the longer-term political objectives, one thing that we've realized in the last few weeks is that this is not going to be a short war. Saddam Hussein has dug himself in all sorts of ways. He's dug some of his forces into concrete bunkers. He himself is on for the ride. He can't afford to lose. He'll lose his own life. And I think he's quite happy to take Iraq down with him. I think the problems of creating a political vacuum once we defeat him are there, but I don't see how we can do anything about it, because defeating Saddam must be our main objective. Now, I was impressed by the obvious shock and sadness of the American spokesman. I don't think that was put on for the cameras. I think that was something they felt. I think they'd been moved as we were by those pictures, despite being professional soldiers. I think we should respect that. If it isn't an intolerable paradox, they are trying to fight this war in as humane a fashion as possible. But the objectives remain. And also, we've always talked throughout this war as if the Arab members of the coalition were likely to break off at any moment. They know their own region. And I think, with all respect to Marshal Wiley, the idea that the Syrians will get terribly upset about civilian casualties, given some of the civilian casualties Assad has inflicted on his own people, that's a bit far-fetched. I think the Arabs know the issues involved as well as we do. They took their decision in a clear-eyed way. They will stick to it. We must proceed.
Martin Jakes. Sorry, I just wanted, before we bring in one of our other guests who's joined, Martin Jakes, Marxism Today. Do you agree with the point that the Arab members of the coalition are going to be quite steadfast, even with events like this?
Well, it's difficult to say in the longer run. In the short run, yes, I think that Bruce is right about that. But I think you've got to take a wider perspective than just the Arab partners in the coalition. The question is what events like this will do to the wider Arab feeling in the whole region. And clearly, whatever the perceptions are in a country like our own or other Western countries, then the sight of these kind of casualties, the scenes of the women and children, are going to have an effect on Arab public opinion, which is going to, I think, increase that sense of resentment and aggrievement, which is such a characteristic, I think, of Arab opinion in many countries. And this will happen as well, I think, in Egypt and Syria. I think one's kidding oneself if we don't think that's going to happen. But I think that more generally, you see, where I disagree with Bruce is that the meaning of this, it's absolutely clear, obviously, that this kind of thing was going to happen. I mean, it's inconceivable it wasn't going to happen. But so far, the way in which, at least in PR terms, the war's been conducted is that this is precision bombing, smart weapons, and basically virtually no civilian casualties. I mean, there has been on television virtually no sight so far of civilian casualties. I'm thinking of perhaps Scud missile attacks on Israel. There was the bodies then. Kafji, there were no bodies on television that one saw because of the way the thing was managed and so on. There was the American killed in the Turkish base incident. But otherwise, this is the first sight. So this is bound to have a changed perception. Suddenly, in a sense, the reality of war, which of course has always been there, and there's a lot more civilian casualties than has been admitted so far, all up until, at least until this week. And suddenly the reality, this is a war. You know, whatever the new technology, this is a war with civilian casualties, with unfortunate casualties, is coming up. And that's bound to have an effect. I don't think it's going to be a dramatic effect in terms of Western opinion, but it's an important staging post.
And what about the way that the offensive might be waged from here on? Will military men change their minds, change their target?
Well, I understand that already the War Cabinet here has discussed the question of shifting the nature of the bombing from highly populated areas in Iraq, like Baghdad, to more of a focused attack on military targets and so on. And I think from a Western point of view, that would be wise, because you know, there is a military campaign, but there's also a political campaign going on here. And it's not only one being conducted in terms of, as it were, the Western theatre of opinion, but in terms of a third world, and particularly an Arab theatre of opinion. And that is extremely important. And it's one that here we're likely to, you know, completely underrate, but it is extremely important because the coalition partners are Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and so on.
Now, Carmen Nabulsi, we go on and on. Every time this issue is raised, almost everything that happens in this war is related immediately to the reaction that it's going to have among Muslims and Arabs and so on. How do you think it will actually alter or persuade people in those countries, change their points of view or harden their points of view?
I think there has been a sensation since the beginning of this war and since the massive bombardments, although we haven't seen any pictures, I think, as you mentioned before, that this was going on. And I think it kind of confirmed it to a lot of Arabs, although they're outraged by actually seeing pictures where they haven't been able to before. But the feelings of anxiety that a lot of Arabs felt was that this war was being waged for the West, for their oil. And I think that now they're saying that it's very difficult when you have planes attacking people and there's not an actual battle going on. It brings you back to the point about the American war in Vietnam, that it was only when American soldiers started being killed, not when all the civilians in Vietnam died, but when American soldiers started being killed that the West paid attention. And I think Arabs feel that. They feel that the coalition forces are trying to protect the casualties of the coalition forces as opposed to civilian casualties. I'm not saying that they did this on purpose. I believe it was a mistake, but I also believe they should say it was a mistake instead of saying it was a justified military target. And I think this kind of confirms the Arab opinion of how they see that.
There's been great fear in the West, particularly in the United States, about terrorism as a result of this war. Again, mixed signals, really. President Saddam, I think, called at one stage for that, for acts of terrorism. Now, you're a former deputy representative of the PLO in London. Is the PLO going to be in the business of terrorism as a result of this incident? Is this going to make acts of terrorism more likely?
No, I think maybe acts of terrorism, but I don't think by the PLO. You see, what the PLO is a political vehicle for achieving Palestinian political rights. And it's when people believe that politics are not going to get them anywhere that they turn to terrorism. It's the politics of despair, of saying the political institutions, negotiations, Security Council resolutions are not there for us. They're only there for other people. And the PLO has so far not managed to produce, although they have accepted everything that's been asked of them, Israelis that will negotiate with them. So I think there might be people who would respond to that, Palestinians, as opposed to the PLO.
Nick, there's something we haven't heard about so far in this discussion, that's Kuwait. Now, presumably, Karma, as a representative of the PLO, you were in favour of the rights
I'm
as well.
not
You were.
actually
A former, you were.
Former
and
deputy
presumably you
representative.
haven't repudiated your former allegiance. You were in favour of the rights of small nations, including the
Yeah.
Palestinian nation. Well, why not then the right of the Kuwaiti nation? And why is that being so ignored? Now, the reason the West is fighting is to get Iraq out of Kuwait. Saddam Hussein could end this war tomorrow by getting out of Kuwait and by ending the agony of the Kuwaiti civilians. Now, surely you, as a PLO supporter, more than any of the rest of us, ought to appreciate the agony of the Kuwaiti people. I'm surprised that seems to play such a small part in your thinking.
No, it doesn't. I was actually responding to the questions that were being asked of me. I believe Kuwait is a sovereign nation, and I believe the Kuwaiti people have suffered very much. And there's also, from actually a Palestinian point of view, a large Palestinian community in Kuwait that have also suffered tremendously, 300,000 Palestinians. But the way that we see this being conducted, in that sovereign rights are not respected, especially Palestinians, for the last 23 years in the occupied territories, and especially since '78 when you had this right-wing government. And we've had no way, I mean, we're not saying that you should go and carpet bomb Israel for not withdrawing. We're saying negotiate, and I think we saw that we would like to see some of negotiations or some possibility that there wouldn't be this kind of outcome.
Let's deal with the wrongs one by one. Let's get the Iraqis out of Kuwait and then discuss other issues. You therefore are in favour of war to get Iraq out of Kuwait, are you?
No, I don't know if it's the best way. I really don't know. I would
What
feel more,
alternative
this
would
is
there be?
personally, I would feel more comfortable seeing if sanctions worked. I don't feel comfortable in my own mind that those options have been tried.
We've had a few weeks of sanctions by means of military action. The bombing of Iraq is a form of sanction. The bombing of Baghdad, the bombing of electricity and water, that is sanctions on the most brutal scale, and it hasn't worked.
Sanctions didn't work, and they were being proved to be very leaky.
And the fact that Saddam Hussein is able to stand up to all this bombing proves the ineffectiveness of sanctions. That could have gone on forever.
I'm not, you know, I mean, I think now the war's started, we're into a different ballgame anyway. So the question of whether or not, you know, it was correct to go for war then is now, in a sense, an academic question. But given that it's been raised, it seems to me the problem is that once you start a war like this, you can't predict the outcome of it. No one knows what the outcome is. I mean, you were saying earlier, for example, is this going to be a short war or a long war? I mean, under what terms is it going to end? Just like at the Second World War, no one knew how it would end. No one knew it would lead to the division of Germany for 40 years with Soviet and American troops still facing each other. And I think that one of the problems of now we're into this war phase is that exactly what is going to happen and what the outcomes are going to be are extremely difficult to predict. Now, there's no doubt at all, you know, that getting rid of getting Saddam Hussein and Iraqi troops out of Kuwait is extremely important, and I wouldn't mind if Saddam Hussein fell in the process. But I'm not at all confident that the settlement, whatever settlement it might be, that is arrived at in the Middle East is going to be better than the situation we've had previously. In fact, my guess is that once you're using this level of force in a situation like that, once you have, as it were, detonated in a new way the problem of the relationship between the Western world and the Arab world, then the Middle East is going to be a very messy business for a long time.
Well, I hope Martin won't fall off his chair if I say that this old Air Chief Marshal agrees with a great deal of what he said. I hope that doesn't get you drummed out of the brownies.
Not at all.
But have I got time just to go back to a point that Bruce made and was previously made by Marshal Wiley? And it is this. There's a nightmare situation, a nightmare outcome of all of this. And Rosemary and I were talking with a leader of Iraqi opposition in this country who said the nightmare situation for them would be a situation where the infrastructure of Iraq was partly or totally destroyed, but Saddam Hussein was still there, and that would be the worst of all worlds as far as they were concerned. Could I also go back, because I've been dying just to correct 2 points, or to put right 2 points. Marshal Wiley was talking a great deal of common sense, but he was wrong absolutely when he's talking about 20% of bombs hit civilian targets and 80%. That is not happening in this war. The percentage of weapons that have hit civilians...
I think what he said was that 20% of bombs didn't hit their intended targets, and therefore civilians were at risk.
I'd actually take issue with that. I mean, the number of weapons that have, other than those that have been cruise missiles shot down by Iraqi air defences, or Iraqi surface-to-air missiles that have gone wild and fallen back to ground, the number of weapons, this is the first time we've actually seen any weapon out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that have actually done civilian damage. So we're talking about 0.00001%. The other thing which actually made me curl up was your academic from Georgetown University, whose name I have deliberately forgotten, saying
I can't remember it either.
We don't much care how many Iraqis are killed. Could I say that's the words of an academic and not of an airman, and I'm damn sure not of any of those airmen who are engaged in the conflict at the moment.
But can I mean, I'm awfully sorry, we have to take a break. An awful thing to say. This is a commercial channel. We will come back on this discussion straight after it. Do join us then.
For many years, the Poultney Clinic has been helping ordinary, everyday men and women improve faces and figures. If you're considering cosmetic surgery, ask your GP about the Poultney Clinic or ring direct for free literature. Cosmetic surgery is not just for the rich and famous. It could do your confidence the world of good.
Look at my floor. Ow!
Dog's got muddy paws.
Come on, I'll do it in no time.
Not with that. You need Flash.
Okay, race you.
No contest. Watch, Flash will shift this greasy mess.
That's not fair.
If you want to finish faster, you can use Flash next time.
What next time? Flash cleans greasy grime in half the time.
It's full of fun. Phone Chatterbox now. 0898 555 888 for the great new Chatterbox line.
Get me detergent and fabric softener.
Detergent, softener.
Don't forget my purse.
That's not enough. I'm dead. Bold Ultra all-in-one. Planes, the softener in it. I've got enough. Thanks, but no thanks.
You made a good choice. Was it expensive?
Actually, it costs less than the auto.
Less? Brilliant. Then we'll be buying your Bold Ultra from now on. Won't you?
Kellogg's Crunchy Nut Cornflakes are delicious golden flakes of corn encrusted with honey, nuts and brown sugar. Which makes them absolutely irresistible. Kellogg's Crunchy Nut Cornflakes. The trouble is, they taste too good.
Here at Vidal Sassoon, we believe everyone can have salon beautiful hair. But everyone's hair is different, so how do we do it? New Vidal Sassoon Salon Collection. Salon shampoos and salon conditioners. You select your own combination, so it's tailor-made for your particular hair. For salon beautiful hair. New Vidal Sassoon Salon Collection. Tailor-made for salon beautiful hair.
When I said spots, I meant the ones on your shirt.
Boys and spots. Has she got problems? Her cosmetic cleanser leaves dirt behind, but Clearasil lotion cleanses pore deep. So it removes twice as much grease. Use it every day to help prevent spots. Maybe, Dave?